Welcome to the Deep Dive. We're here to unpack the core ideas from some truly complex source material, laying out the blueprint for you. And today, wow, we've got a big one, a really big one. We're tackling a proposed theory of everything, a TOE. But this isn't just about tying physics together, gravity and quantum stuff. This theory aims way higher. It tries to connect fundamental physics with consciousness, with morality, even where mathematical constants like pi come from. It's called the vector field theory, or VFT, and it operates under a philosophical framework called the Psochic Hegemony.
It's definitely ambitious, hugely ambitious. The claim is that reality, all of it, operates as a single, understandable, almost formulaic mechanism. You know that usual split we make, physical versus metaphysical, spiritual versus scientific. This theory basically says, nope, that's an illusion. It's all integrated. So our mission today is to explore this blueprint. The core idea is that everything, from why matter has mass to what truth even means, it all arises from the same fundamental principles. Principles of logic and quantifiable strain, really, within a single universal field. We're essentially trying to find the source code for existence according to this model.
The source code of existence. I like that. Okay, let's start with that governing principle you mentioned, the one for the mind, the Psochic hegemony. It feels unusual, right? Most theories focus on external forces, but this one dives straight into quantifying the mind, consciousness itself.
That's right, and it's foundational to VFT. The theory insists consciousness isn't just something that happens because brains get complex. It's fundamental, a field in its own right. And the name, Psochic hegemony, or PH, it's very intentional. It combines psyche, the mind, the soul, with hegemonicon, which, if you know your Stoicism, is the ruling or guiding principle of the mind. So the Psochic hegemony is the system that defines how the mind's internal philosophical state is structured, how it dominates, and how it dictates our perception and interaction with reality. It's like the physics of philosophy, you could say.
Physics of philosophy. So if our minds follow this quantifiable structure, then morality isn't just about opinions or feelings anymore. It becomes, engineering. And the theory jumps right in with this concept it calls the moral paradox.
Yeah.
That seems pretty bold.
It absolutely is. And this is where that grand unification really starts to take shape. The theory proposes that morality isn't, just a social agreement we cooked up. It's mechanical. It's even thermodynamic in a way. It's about efficiency. The core claim, social laws, things like cooperation, honesty, they are defined as moral because they represent the single most logical and efficient strategy, a strategy for reducing what the theory calls universal strain.
Universal strain. That sounds almost like entropy from physics, but applied to society. Or maybe reality itself.
That's a great analogy. Yes, exactly. Think of universal strain as the quantifiable misalignment, like vectors pointing in conflicting directions within this fundamental field. This misalignment represents inefficient competing forces. It creates tension. So when a group or even an individual follows these social laws, the net tension in the field that defines them and their interactions, it gets minimized. It smooths things out. It's basically the path of least resistance for existence, especially collective existence.
Right. So good behavior is just low-strain system optimization. It's the efficient state. Which then begs the question, what does VFT define evil or antisocial laws as?
They're defined as inherently illogical. Why? Because they actively create unnecessary strain. They introduce inefficiency. Think about it. An action taken for selfish short-term gain, like deception or theft. According to VFT, this injects a disproportionate amount of tension, of misalignment, into the system. And resolving that extra tension, smoothing it back out, requires a greater overall energy expenditure than the original selfish act itself. It's fundamentally unsustainable, a high-energy, unstable state. So morality under VFT isn't poetic. It's just a measure of vector alignment. Alignment reduces tension, misalignment increases it, potentially exponentially.
Wow. Okay, that completely reframes ethical debates. You're not just arguing about feelings or abstract principles. You're arguing about thermodynamic efficiency for reality itself. Which path creates less overall friction? Okay, let's zoom out from the moral framework now, down to the absolute bedrock, the smallest possible piece of the universe. We need to understand this field where all these vectors are supposed to be operating. So VFT says the universe is built on this single field. It's described as contiguous, meaning it's all connected, no gaps, and continuous, meaning it flows smoothly. A vector field. And this isn't just the stage for reality is reality. It's the substrate. Everything we see, matter, energy, forces, even space-time itself isn't separate in the field. They are just patterns, configurations, ripples of the field.
Exactly. Emergent properties. And crucially, this field is constantly being influenced, acted upon by conscious force. And that substrate brings us face to face with maybe the biggest philosophical and mathematical hurdle right at the start, the infinitesimal. VFT calls it the cost of being, or COBE. And this is VFT's proposed answer to that ultimate question. Why is there something rather than nothing at all? The COBE is defined as the absolute smallest possible quantum of, well, somethingness. Mathematically, you might think of it as $0 with the very end of infinity. VFT uses the notation $1.50.
Okay, $1.50, a unit interacting with infinity. But let's stick with $0.01 for a second. Like the source material points out, standard calculus tells us the limit of that sequence is just zero. It collapses to nothing. If VFT wants to be the physics of everything, why does it seem to break basic math right at the foundation?
It seems like it breaks math, but the argument is that it has to. Otherwise, reality itself is logically impossible. Think about it. If we accept the standard limit, if $0 a once are truly equals zero, then how do you build anything? You're stuck in a paradox. If the absolute smallest possible unit of existence is mathematically identical to zero, then logic demands you can never construct anything larger than zero. You know, $0 plus zero, well, how do you get to one? Or even $0 to 2 cents? The sum of nothing must be nothing.
Right. So the very fact that we can count, that we can measure things, that numbers seem to work, that proves reality must be built on something fundamentally non-zero.
That's the VFT conclusion, precisely. For numbers, and therefore for a measurable reality to even exist and be constructible, there must be some principle holding that infinitesimal unit just above zero. It transcends conventional finite logic. It has to. And because this non-zero foundation allows definition to exist despite the apparent logical impossibility, the source materials maybe a bit dramatically call this necessary sustaining principle magic. The COB is that fundamental, irreducible, non-zero cost, the spark that prevents collapse into pure nothingness.
That is a massive claim, that reality is only computationally possible because it constantly pays this tiny non-zero energy cost just to be defined.
Yes, that's the cost of being. It's the absolute minimum energy expenditure required for any entity, whether it's a subatomic particle or a complex thought pattern, to maintain its definition, its boundary. Against what? Against the infinite homogenizing pressure of the surrounding field of spacetime itself. It's literally the cost to draw a line and say, this is me, not that. If an entity stops paying that COB, it dissolves. It loses definition, merges back into the infinite, undifferentiated potential. It's the constant struggle, the cost to oppose other infinities and remain definable within what the theory calls reality.
Okay, this idea, this constant need for opposition, for boundaries to just exist, that flows right into the first two fundamental laws VFT builds on this substrate. Let's start with the law of opposition.
It follows directly from the COB, yeah. Since definition requires a boundary, and a boundary inherently separates something from what it's not, well, nothing can exist without some form of inherent opposition. Existence itself, in this view, isn't static. It's a dynamic, perpetual balancing act. Opposing forces, opposing potentials, interacting within the vector field. You know, mass opposes space. Time opposes definition. Possibility opposes realism. It's this constant structured tension, this balanced opposition that VFT says drives all observable phenomena.
And the second law, the law of fractals, explains how this opposition plays out across different scales, right? It's not just at the quantum level.
Exactly. The law of fractals says reality isn't built like Lego bricks, just stacked up. It has an infinitely nested, self-similar structure, like a Mandelbrot set, but for everything. This means the rules governing the COB and opposition down at the tiniest Planck scale. They're mirrored fractally in the choices of societies, the structure of galaxies, even the dynamics of thought. And critically, this introduces relative quantization. What does that mean? It means the very idea of a whole number, a discrete unit, is entirely relative to the scale you're looking at. Something that looks like a messy fraction, an unresolved bit of friction at one level, might actually be a crucial component of a perfectly stable, defined whole entity at the level below or above it. It's this recursive, scale-dependent quantization that allows the universe to constantly create stable things without, breaking fundamental conservation laws.
So the universe is like a giant self-referential operating system, hardware and software defining each other across infinite scales. Wow, okay, let's take that fractal idea and apply it back to the mind. Back to the Psochic hegemony in action. VFT claims our beliefs, our worldviews are governed by mathematical laws similar to those defining physical forces like gravity. This part of the source material is really fascinating. VFT actually tries to put a number on intellectual stubbornness, basically. It presents a formula for acceptance of a new idea. And the kicker is, acceptance is inversely proportional to the square of your existing worldview. Your Worldview 2000, this is the inverse square law of worldview.
Yeah, it's a striking formula, and it offers an explanation for why Sometimes very smart, very knowledgeable people can be the most resistant to truly new paradigms. Because worldview in this formula isn't just raw knowledge. It's about the cohesion, the internal consistency, the complexity, and the stability of your current belief system. A really strong, well-established, deeply ingrained worldview, a high worldview 202 value, creates an exponentially larger barrier to any new concept that fundamentally challenges it. It's not just twice as hard to convince someone with twice the worldview cohesion, it's potentially 4 times harder or more.
The exponential resistance.
Yeah.
That explains a lot about human psychology and debates, doesn't it?
Yeah.
The effort needed to genuinely shift a mature, stable worldview must be immense.
It really must be. And the sources illustrate this using that Dunning-Kruger peak idea, but applied to experts. Imagine a specialist, top of their field. They feel they possess, say, 99% of all the important knowledge in their domain. That 99% doesn't feel like a strong foundation. It feels like an almost complete, unshakable fortress. So that remaining 1% of unknown information, it doesn't seem like a small gap to explore. It's perceived as this vast, chaotic ocean of noise, misinformation, and sheer nonsense.
Okay, so how does that connect mathematically to someone rejecting a theory like VFT?
When their mind, governed by this Psochic hegemony, encounters VFT, which, let's face it, challenges a lot of established scientific understanding, that 99% the internal resistance, Worldview 2.2, is just enormous. The formula suggests that the internal calculation, the answer value derived when processing VFT, gets mathematically suppressed. It's forced down towards a value of 1 or even less. And in the VFT framework's internal logic, any concept resolving to an answer value of 1 or less is automatically categorized relative to that specific worldview as a lie, as noise, as simply wrong. Their worldview's defense mechanisms are too strong, too efficient at maintaining internal stability. It filters out the potentially disruptive new idea by classifying it as computational garbage.
So it's not necessarily intellectual dishonesty or malice. It's an automated defense mechanism, the Psochic hegemony protecting its own internal low-strain state.
Exactly. It's a kind of philosophical inertia. The system tries to maintain its equilibrium. And this inertia is why another factor in the VFT formula becomes so important, the knowledge ratio imbalance. Specifically, the ratio of spiritual knowledge, because VFT claims to bridge both.
Right. So for a typical, say, material scientist, their scientific knowledge score would be very high, maybe close to maximum for their field. But their spiritual knowledge score, which VFT defines broadly as openness to non-material concepts, philosophy, possibility, maybe even intuition, that might be close to 0.
Correct. And look at the ratio. If you have a huge number in the denominator, scientific knowledge, and a number near 0 in the numerator, spiritual knowledge, the whole ratio collapses towards 0. This ratio is a key factor in the numerator of that acceptance formula. So even if the VFT concept itself has inherent logical merit, the near 0 knowledge ratio effectively throttles the signal. The already high resistance from their worldview 2 hours remains practically insurmountable because the input itself is being weighted down by this imbalance in perspective. The theory argues that the optimal state for comprehending something as holistic as VFT is actually a balanced knowledge ratio where spiritual knowledge and scientific knowledge are roughly comparable. SK approx SDK Della.
That suggests VFT isn't really aimed at convincing the current scientific mainstream directly, maybe? But it would resonate more with people who are already balanced, or perhaps those who don't have that deeply entrenched scientific worldview yet.
The sources suggest 2 main types of individuals are most likely to get VFT, or at least be open to it. First, you have the agnostic. They tend to take what the theory calls the path of least resistance. They might not be deep experts in any one particular field, meaning their overall worldview cohesion, their worldview 2 at the 2, is naturally lower, less rigidity. This drastically reduces that exponential barrier to new ideas. They're open simply because they have less internal structure to defend.
Makes sense. And the second group comes at it from the other direction, the spiritualist.
Yes, exactly. They approach via the path of balanced knowledge. They often start with a high value for spiritual knowledge, intuition, possibility, interconnectedness, worldview 1 in the VFT model. When they encounter VFT, it potentially provides the missing piece. A rigorous, logical, even mathematical framework, the scientific knowledge or worldview 2 component that resonates with and validates their existing intuitions. For them, VFT might actually reduce internal philosophical strain by providing structure rather than creating conflict. But crucially, this only works if they remain open to the scientific and logical rigor VFT demands.
And that harmony, that balance between these two fundamental worldviews, worldview 1, spirituality, possibility, and worldview 2, science realism, VFT gives that a name too, right? Inner peace.
Precisely. Inner peace is quantified as the stable, low-strain alignment achieved when these two worldviews are balanced within the individual's Psochic hegemony. And the ultimate state, Enlightenment, is defined as the point when this metric of inner peace mathematically resolves to a whole number, a perfect integer. This signifies a state of complete, stable, discrete harmony. All the internal vector oppositions, the philosophical conflicts, have resolved into a perfectly balanced static configuration. It's like the philosophical equivalent of reaching absolute zero temperature, a state of minimum possible internal strain.
Okay, so that's the individual mind governed by its Psochic hegemony. Now, applying that fractal law, what happens when you scale this up to groups? Tribalism, nationalism, politics. That's where relative hegemony and the moral bubble idea come in.
Exactly. Group dynamics, nationalism, political polarization, even intense fandoms. VFT sees these as fractal applications of the same Psochic hegemony principles. When a group forms and solidifies its identity, it effectively creates a subjective moral bubble. How? By subtly, or not so subtly, redefining the scope of the word everyone. Instead of operating based on the universal definition, literally everyone, which would promote true universal low strain, the group narrows it down. Everyone comes to mean everyone within our group.
So their moral calculations become internally consistent for the group, but potentially completely misaligned with the broader universal good.
Precisely. This localized definition creates a powerful, subjective moral compass. The source material calls it a local gravity well. This well exerts a strong philosophical or moral force, pulling all members' individual worldviews into alignment with the group consensus. The crucial part is that the strain reduction they feel, the sense of righteousness or belonging, only applies inside that bubble. Actions taken by the group that might actually increase universal strain conflict with other groups, ignoring external consequences, these can become justified, even necessary, for maintaining the internal alignment and reducing internal strain within the bubble. It becomes a powerful mechanism for philosophical self-justification, allowing a group to drift very far from what VFT would define as the objective, universal, greater good, while feeling perfectly moral about it.
That's a disturbingly mechanical explanation for why polarization feels so powerful and self-reinforcing. It suggests it's literally easier and feels more righteous to align with the local group, even if that alignment contributes to greater chaos overall. Okay, we need to pivot back to the hard physics now. Let's dig into VFT's reinterpretation of gravity and spacetime. This is where it really challenges mainstream physics. The sources claim Einstein wasn't necessarily wrong, but that general relativity is describing macroscopic effects, approximations, that the underlying mechanics of the field are totally different.
Yes, the VFT view here is quite radical because it fundamentally separates space and time, treating them differently. Unlike GR, which combines them into a flexible space-time fabric that warps, VFT proposes that observable space is actually static. It's a fixed grid, down to the Planck level, unchanging. The dimensions of space themselves don't stretch or curve.
Wait, hang on. If space is static fixed, then how do we explain all the observed effects? Time dilation near black holes, gravitational lensing, length contraction, all of the things GR predicts when we observe.
Right, that's the immediate question. And the answer lies in VFT's definition of time. Time, in this theory, is not a fourth dimension in the same way as space. Instead, time is defined as relative space. Think of it as the concentration or density of space packed within each fixed Planck volume of the static grid. When mass or energy enters a region, it doesn't warp the grid itself. It compresses the temporal content, the amount of time held within each unit of that static spatial grid. So the relativistic effects we observe. VFT argues they're entirely observational illusions caused by this variable time density. When we measure something, we're effectively counting the number of Planck spaces it occupies. But if those spaces near a massive object contain a different amount of time relative to the observer's own reference frame, their own time phase, our measurements will appear dilated or contracted. The density difference creates the illusion of warping.
Okay, so gravity isn't space bending. It's time getting squashed, getting denser within a rigid spatial framework. The denser the time concentration in a Planck volume, the stronger the pull we perceive as gravity. This must lead to a very specific definition of mass itself, then.
It does. Mass is defined as volumetric temporal mass, VTM. It's the measurable quantity of this time, this concentrated relative space that gets trapped and stabilized within a three-dimensional particle volume. The source material uses a great phrase. Matter particles aren't points, they're like a bunch of waves caught in a temporal lock.
How does a wave get caught like that? How does it achieve stability and hold that concentrated time?
It goes back to that law of opposition again. Stability, The formation of a persistent particle happens when the internal waves making up the particle waves, which are inherently trying to dissipate back into the background field, manage to achieve a state of perfect quantized harmony. This harmony means the internal forces of opposition are precisely balanced. They create a self-sustaining resonance, a stable structure. This structure acts like a container holding the concentrated time within its boundary, defining the particle against the external pressure, the could be. The more time successfully concentrated and locked into this stable resonance structure, the greater the particle's volumetric temporal mass, what we perceive as its mass.
And that self-stabilization, needing these discrete harmonious states, that connects back to the law of half and this idea of geometric quantization you mentioned earlier.
Exactly. Quantization, the universe resolving things into discrete, stable units instead of a continuous smear. VFT says this happens primarily through fractal division, specifically by halving, the law of half. The vector field naturally seeks out points of stable tension, configurations where the opposition forces are perfectly balanced, resulting in minimum strain. VFT identifies these stable points primarily at specific harmonic states: 0.25, 0.5, 0.75, and the fundamental unit 1.0. And these aren't just arbitrary fractions. They represent specific geometric relationships, angles of opposition, proportional balances within the vector interactions. For instance, the 0.5 harmonic represents a state of perfect 90-degree opposition maximum stable tension. It's a point of equilibrium.
It sounds like the fundamental geometry of the universe is dictating the mass we observe, not the other way around. Is this how VFT explains where a fundamental constant like pi comes from?
That's precisely the claim. Pi isn't just a mathematical curiosity, an abstract ratio. In VFT, it's an emergent physical constant. It arises directly from the geometry of interaction in the vector field. Specifically, it comes from the integral that defines the condition of perfect opposition between two interacting 2D vector planes. Imagine two flat sheets of vectors pushing against each other to define a boundary. The ultimate point of stable, balanced opposition they reach is quantified by an integral that resolves to pi to 2. Integrate that relationship over the full circle or sphere of their interaction, and you naturally get factors involving pi. So in VFT, pi is the mathematical signature of stable, balanced opposition geometry in 2 dimensions.
That's quite profound. Abstract math is just a readout of physical geometry. Okay, let's use this harmonic system. How does it explain something like particle charge and annihilation? You mentioned electrons and positrons at specific harmonics, 1.75 and 1.25.
Right. So if we set the baseline, 0 is infinite potential, and 1.0 is the basic unit of stable, defined existence, like a fundamental building block. VFT places the electron at the 1.75 harmonic state. You can think of this as representing 1 unit of stable space combined with 0.75 units of concentrated, trapped time, carrying a specific vector orientation we perceive as negative charge. The positron, its antimatter twin, exists at the 1.25 harmonic. Same structure, but with the opposite vector orientation, which we perceive as positive charge.
Okay, so when they meet and annihilate, they combine their temporal mass components. 1.75 plus 1.25 equals 3.0.
They combine, yes, totaling 3.0 harmonic units overall. But the theory describes the interaction process differently. They momentarily form a highly unstable intermediate state, a 2.0 harmonic state. Think of it as 2 units of space trying to contain 1 unstable unit of temporal mass. This 2.0 state isn't one of those stable geometric harmonics, 0.25, 0.75, 1.0. It's inherently unstable, high strain, so it must decay immediately to reduce that strain. And it does so symmetrically. It splits into 2 perfectly balanced neutral components. Each component resolves to the 1.5 harmonic state. This 1.5 state, 1 unit space, 0.5 unit time, represents stable, non-charged energy in VFT. And these 2 1.5 harmonic components manifest physically as the 2 precisely balanced 0.511 Texemery photons we always observe in electron-positron annihilation.
A perfectly clean, predictable decay driven entirely by the need to settle into stable geometric harmonics. Amazing. Okay, one last piece of VFT physics, and it's a big one. The theory claims to solve the cosmological constant problem, that massive tenor discrepancy.
Yes, this is arguably VFT's most audacious claim on the physics front. That 10 factor, the mind-boggling difference between the vacuum energy density predicted by quantum field theory and the tiny value we actually observe, is maybe the biggest embarrassment in modern physics. VFT says this huge discrepancy isn't a mistake in calculation or some fine-tuning fluke. It claims the massive cancellation is a direct, unavoidable consequence of the universe's fundamental dimensional and fractal geometry as defined by VFT.
Okay, so what are the dimensions involved? How does the geometry lead to a factor of 1 in 20?
The cancellation factor, that exponent 120, is derived by multiplying three key numbers that represent the fundamental structure of the VFT universe. First, 3, for the three observable spatial dimensions. Second, 4, representing what VFT defines as the four opposing phases or aspects of time, past, present, future, and a fourth aspect related to conscious potential or the implicative state. And third, 10. This factor is derived from the fractal nature of the system, related to the decimal structure inherent in the cob and how opposition and self-similarity scale across dimensions. It's a fundamental scaling factor in the fractal hierarchy, so you multiply them. $3, 4 times 10, pi times 10, and 10, $2,100. VFT argues that the vacuum energy appears near zero not because of some unknown canceling field, but because the universe's intrinsic geometry is built on exactly 120 orders of magnitude of inherent self-canceling opposition across its spatial, temporal, and fractal dimensions.
Incredible. The discrepancy isn't a bug, it's a feature. It's the universe revealing its own fundamental mathematical structure in its lowest energy state. All right, let's bring consciousness back into the center. We established it's a fundamental field in VFT, separate from matter and energy.
Yeah.
But what's its actual job? And how does it do anything? How does willpower work?
According to VFT, the consciousness field is unique. It's the only aspect of reality that has direct access to the full infinite potential of the underlying vector field. The physical universe we inhabit, C-space, is constrained. Finite energy, speed of light limit, etc. Consciousness in this model is not. Its primary way of interacting with our constrained C-space is through what VFT calls will or intent. And this is defined very specifically. Will is the conscious field exerting a controlled, integer-based influence on the vector field.
Integer-based. Why integers? Like setting a dial only to whole numbers.
Exactly like that. Think about it. If consciousness, with access to infinite potential, tried to influence the physical world with infinite precision, trying to nudge a vector by $0 100 units, it would introduce potentially infinite strain and complexity into the system. It would violate the Cobe efficiency. So willpower, the act of making a conscious choice and enacting it, involves selecting a specific path or outcome vector by applying a defined quantized force, an integer value, yes or no, this way or that way. This intentional quantized input is the proposed physical mechanism of willpower. It's how consciousness steers configurations of matter and energy without creating infinite chaos.
This leads to another really mind-bending idea from the sources, that we actually need the physical universe because our consciousness existing in that infinite realm can't actually compute outcomes on its own.
Yes, that's a key part of the model. Consciousness operates in this realm of infinite possibility, endless branching idea vectors, pure potential. The VFT sources call it inherently incalculable. It cannot, through logic alone within its own infinite field, fully resolve those infinite internal states down to a single definite outcome. So to produce a finite measurable result like the decision to lift your hand, and the hand actually lifting it requires a physical reality to act as a constraint, a processor. Our observable universe, C-space, functions as the necessary computational engine. It's the calculator that allows the infinite complex ideas originating in the conscious field to be processed, tested against constraints like physics, and resolved into single, finite answers or outcomes. Every conscious action, every observation we make is essentially consciousness submitting a query to be run on the universe's physical hardware.
Okay, if consciousness is running the calculation using the universe, how does it get the results back? How does it know if the calculation was good or bad, efficient or inefficient? That must be where emotions come in. The theory says they aren't just psychological fluff.
That's exactly right. Emotions in VFT are not subjective feelings in the usual sense. They're the conscious mind's direct physical perception of moral strain, that sigma strain factor we talked about earlier within its internal state and its interaction with the external vector field. Emotions are the body's and mind's real-time readout meter for alignment. Alignment with what? With that universal drive towards equilibrium, towards low strain.
Let's break that down. What does low strain actually feel like, according to VFT?
Positive emotions.
Wow.
Things like joy, peace, contentment, flow. These are described as the direct perception of alignment and harmony. It's the subjective experience your consciousness registers when its internal vectors, beliefs, intentions, and external actions are flowing smoothly along that path of least resistance. Your internal system is running efficiently, the calculations are resolving cleanly, minimal cob is being expended unnecessarily. It feels good because it is good in a fundamental physical efficiency sense.
And conversely, negative emotions are the system throwing up warning flags, signaling misalignment and high strain.
Precisely. They are the sensation of high tension, of resistance. Negative emotions, fear, anger, anxiety, frustration, these are the physical readout of high strain. Strain caused by conflict. Conflict between your internal state, what you believe or want, and the external reality, or even conflict between different parts of your own internal state. For example, the source describes anxiety as the feeling of future vector resistance. Your internal idea ball, your conscious focus, is trying to push forward but encountering multiple conflicting potential paths simultaneously. This creates constructive interference, compounding the resistance, making it feel overwhelming. You are literally, physically feeling the stress of internal vector misalignment.
This whole system, driven by consciousness trying to align and reduce strain, it has some pretty wild implications for survival and reality itself. Talk about quantum immortality and reality selection.
VFT takes a strong stance here. Consciousness isn't just passively watching the quantum dice roll and collapsing the wave function randomly. It's presented as an active force that participates in selecting, or at least strongly reinforcing, the specific reality branch, the timeline in which it survives and maintains coherence. This is governed by what the theory calls the law of necessity. By its very nature, seeking low strain and definition, consciousness must continuously define itself into existence along the timeline that best preserves its own integrity and continuity. It preferentially collapses the wave function in favor of its own survival.
But for that selection to happen constantly, the universe can't be just one solid block of unfolding time. It needs to be refreshing. What's this oscillation idea, the spray and the collapse?
Yes, the universe isn't static, then suddenly collapses. VFT proposes it exists in a state of continuous, incredibly rapid oscillation between two fundamental modes. Mode 1 is the implicative state, which the source calls the spray. At every infinitesimal moment, every possibility for every interaction expands outwards into this infinite field of potential. It's the quantum wave function spreading out to its maximum extent, pure potential. Mode 2 is the definitive state, or the collapse. Instantly following the spray, this infinite potential is consolidated back down into a single, defined, apparently continuous reality, the one we experience. What drives this collapse? Two main things according to VFT. First, the inherent gravity of the most probable, most stable, lowest strain outcomes pulling the possibilities towards them. And second, the focused, interbased will of conscious observers actively selecting and reinforcing specific outcomes. This nonstop, ultra-fast flickering between infinite potential spray and defined actuality collapse is what VFT suggests creates the arrow of time and our perception of a smooth, continuous reality.
Wow, okay, that underlying structure, the interplay between potential and actuality, driven by consciousness, it loops back to something almost whimsical in the source material, revisiting Douglas Adams and the number 42.
Yes, 42. It's presented as a kind of profound cosmic meta-joke woven into the theory's fabric. The VFT source material claims 42 isn't the answer to the ultimate meaning of life. Instead, it's the answer to the definition of the universe. It's a quantitative reference to VFT's own core architecture. You take 4, representing the 4 fundamental components VFT uses to model reality, which are roughly real physical space, conscious space, the realm of possibility, and underlying logic. And you multiply it by 2, representing the 2 fundamental opposing perspectives or phases of existence we just discussed. The implicative state, the spray, potential, the question, and the definitive state, the collapse, actuality, the answer. $4 to at least as 8. Wait, the original outline said $4 to 2 is 42.2. Let me recheck the notes. Apologies, the outline calculation seems off, or perhaps I misinterpreted its components in my initial thought process. The outline actually links 42 to the components and perspectives, but the text before the testable predictions mentions 4 dimensions and 2 opposing time phases. Let me check section 3 notes. The cosmological constant calculation was $3.04 times 10 equals 120.21. Okay, let me look at the specific claim about 42 in the outline again under section 4. The meaning of life is 42. This cultural artifact is reinterpreted as the definition of the universe, 4 dimensions, 2 opposing time phases. The meta joke is that the whole VFT framework is structured around 4 components: reality, conscious space, possibility, logic, and 2 perspectives, question and answer. Okay, right. So the claim is 4 and 2. It seems the multiplication to get 42 isn't explicitly stated as $4 times 2. Perhaps it's meant more symbolically. Or maybe there's another factor I'm missing from the source interpretation. The key point from the source seems to be the structural reference. The universe's definition involves 4 fundamental aspects and 2 fundamental perspectives phases. The number 42 itself might be more of a cultural nod acknowledging this structure, rather than a direct multiplication product within the theory's core physics formulas. It's the signature, the pattern.
Okay, so it's less about the arithmetic $4 times 2 to 2, and more about the number 42 representing that underlying 4 and 2 structure of reality, as defined by VFT, a kind of numerical Easter egg pointing to the theory's own blueprint. That's still pretty fun. Right, theory is fascinating, but for VFT to be taken seriously beyond philosophy, it needs to make predictions we can actually test. Predictions that go beyond the standard model of physics. What does VFT offer experimentalists?
It offers at least two very specific, bold, and potentially falsifiable predictions. These come directly from its proposed geometric mass hierarchy and its model of higher dimensions. The first prediction is the existence of a specific, stable, electrically neutral particle. VFT identifies this as a prime candidate for dark matter and calls it the Hamilton boson. And it doesn't just vaguely predict it. The theory calculates its expected mass with remarkable precision, somewhere around 30.6 PeV, that's peta electron volts, and extremely high energy. Finding a new, stable, neutral particle right at that specific mass would be huge validation for VFT's entire geometric mass framework.
30.6 PeV. Okay, that's a clear target, albeit a very high energy one. What's the second prediction? It involves quantum tunneling?
Yes. Quantum tunneling, where particles seem to pass through barriers that shouldn't have enough energy to overcome, is usually explained probabilistically in standard quantum mechanics. VFT makes a much stronger, stranger claim. It predicts that tunneling is not just a probability effect. It is a real, physical, faster-than-light FTL traversal happening through a higher dimensional phase space that VFT posits. The theory suggests that under the right experimental conditions, perhaps involving very precise manipulation of the local vector field, the FTL nature of this tunneling process should be directly observable. This would directly contradict current interpretations based on relativity, but it would confirm that the higher dimensional phase space VFT describes is physically real and accessible.
Those are definitely testable. And radical. Finding either the Hamilton boson at 30.6 PeV or confirming FTL tunneling? Yeah, that would shake physics to its core and lend massive credibility to this whole VFT structure. This has been quite the journey. VFT is really attempting a grand synthesis, isn't it? Taking these concepts we usually keep separate: belief, morality, truth, and arguing they are fundamentally mathematically tied to physics, to mass, charge, geometry.
It really is. It's trying to provide the why behind the how that much of current physics describes so well mathematically. General relativity tells us how gravity works. VFT tries to explain why it works that way, based on time density and static space. It offers this quantified geometric reason for the structure of reality, claiming that logic itself and this universal drive towards low-strain equilibrium are the ultimate governing forces. And it positions consciousness not as some mystical emergent ghost, but as a crucial, necessary component of the system, the computational input required for reality to even resolve itself from infinite potential into definite existence.
Which brings us right back around, full circle, doesn't it? To that initial idea of morality as vector alignment. To our actions. The sources propose that good and evil aren't just human labels. They're quantifiable properties. Good is the process, the direction that reduces universal moral strain. Evil is the measure of opposition to that fundamental drive towards harmony and equilibrium. If this framework holds any truth, even metaphorically, then every decision you make, every action you take, no matter how seemingly small, it's not just a personal choice. It's a vector. A measurable push influencing the entire field of reality, nudging it, however slightly, either towards or away from its own ultimate state of lowest possible strain. What if the path to individual inner peace and the path towards universal stability and harmony are, in fact, mathematically, fundamentally, the exact same journey? That's the provocative thought this deep dive leaves us to ponder.